Lindsay and Tina. In the 1990s, the term sleaze stuck to John Major's Conservative government like glue. The word Tory was often followed by all kinds of scandals involving money, sex and even perjury. Jonathan Aitken, David Miller, Alan Clark hit the headlines, and by 1997 the Conservative Party became synonymous with unacceptable behaviour. 30 years later, the word has returned to haunt the party.
As you will be well aware by now, the former Northern Ireland Secretary, Owen Paterson, quit amid a row over his breaking of MPs' lobbying rules. Labour has just announced that it is going to field its own candidate, but opposition parties had been looking at the 1997 election in Tatton when journalist Martin Bell stood as an anti-sleaze candidate and defeated the incumbent Tory MP Neil Hamilton. Mr Hamilton is now the leader of UKIP. He joins me now alongside the businesswoman and Tory party member Felicity Huston. Felicity was also Commissioner for Public Appointments at one stage. Morning to both of you.
Morning.
Morning.
First of all, Mr Hamilton, when you look at what is happening within the Tory party at the moment and the way this has been handled, does it bring back some echoes of the 90s from your point of view?
Well, it certainly gives me a sense of deja vu because I was the victim of a botched inquiry by the then Standards Commissioner, and Owen Paterson seems to have been the victim today. It's quite extraordinary that the Standards Commissioners wrote to the parliamentary clerk on the committee, even before she'd heard any evidence from Owen Paterson, to say that she accepted that he was guilty. And when Owen saw that she'd said that, he produced 17 witnesses whom she failed to examine.
Hang on a second. This was all looked at by a parliamentary committee. We've gone through the report, and I'm quite happy to go through the report again with you. But, I mean, apart from anything else, Mr Paterson admitted that he did use parliamentary headed noted paper on 2 occasions for correspondence relating to his business interests. There are lots of questions about his paid consultancy, his lobbying work on behalf of these 2 firms.
Yeah, well, he's accepted that he broke the rules in respect of the headed note paper. I don't personally think that is a hanging offence, but we've got to keep this matter in perspective.
It's an offence, isn't it? That's the point
here. I mean, this row isn't, from my part anyway, about Owen Paterson. It's about the system which is used to examine allegations against MPs. And as in my case, and I wasn't allowed to cross-examine any of the witnesses giving evidence against me, and when I ultimately appealed to the Standards Committee against the conclusions that the Standards Commissioner had reached, after 2 hours of evidence from me, the committee adjourned for lunch and never came back again. And so they never actually reached any conclusion. But of course, I had the headlines in the newspapers, which were utterly damning. And yet I subsequently went through a 2-year Inland Revenue investigation conducted by the top financial fraud officers, which exonerated me. So, I mean,
although it's important to say that you did also end up eventually with your day in court, literally, and you did lose.
Well, yes, but that is certainly true. But that's a complicated issue, which we can't go into this morning. But all I say is that, in my case, the Inland Revenue spent 2 years where I wasn't protected by any of the rules of evidence in court, and they had the capacity to seek evidence from anybody, anywhere in the world, because I'd given up all rights to confidentiality. They came to the conclusion that the allegations against me were completely groundless. Now, obviously, a standards committee can't replicate the systems of a court of law and so on, but it does seem to me that there ought to be, in the interest of natural justice, some changes to the rules. I think the big problem here is that the government did politicise this by whipping MPs to vote for the motion to set up this select committee to reform the system earlier in the week, and it was bound to end up in this kind of partisan dogfight. Of course, the opposition sent blood, and they obviously want to make as much political capital out of it as possible. In those circumstances, it's very difficult to see how anybody can obtain justice from an investigatory system.
Felicity Huston, I'm really interested to hear what you think about this, because in some ways it feels like you potentially could be riding 2 horses on this. You are a Conservative Party member, Conservative Party supporter, but you've also been a Commissioner for Public Appointments. Yeah. How do you feel about A, the way this has been handled, and B, the whole process that Neil Hamilton's complaining about?
Well, first of all, I would say, the one thing I'll give the Conservative Party, it's not a cult. We don't have to support everything they do just because we're members. And certainly, I think the whole thing has been handled appallingly.
I was going to say, it is worth saying, though, that actually MPs were whipped to do this, which is part of the reason that there's
outrageous. Shouldn't have happened. I mean, that's not how our parliamentary system works. Issues of conscience like that should be left open to the MPs. And it is interesting to see just how many MPs didn't go as their way of dealing with this. And a PPS was threatened with the sack because she voted against the government. It has been a shambles, but it is not just one party or the other. It is a symbol of our parliamentary class, I'm afraid. You've talked about Neil's issues way back in the 1990s. We then move on to loans for peerages. And I was on the House of Lords Appointments Commission when we discovered that was going on. That was under Blair and Brown. We then move on to MPs' expenses, the most appalling scandal. And then we have this one, and it just goes on and on. They seem to have I thought something seems to happen when they become elected to the House of Commons. They seem to forget that they're there on our behalf, that we put them there, and they're not a different class. They're not different people, and they should abide by the rules that everybody else does.
But what about this process? Because we have heard MPs come forward and say there is no appeal here, that these decisions are made, and that they don't have the chance to really put their case forward. Do you think that's true?
Well, they do. No, I don't. I've had a good go through the report, and I'm sure you and yourself, as some of the others have too.
I've got it in front of me here, yeah.
It's a weighty tomb, over 170 pages. It was obviously a lot of work done. The Commissioner does her job, and then she refers her report to the Parliamentary Committee, and they've done their bit. This is not some sort of half-hour job. I mean, she addresses at great length all the criticisms Owen Paterson has made of her investigation. Her job is to do it as it's set out. He's not an employee. This is not some sort of tribunal or a court. It isn't a cross-examining of witnesses, because she's not trying to find facts as they would in a court. I mean, it's just a complete conflation in an attempt, I think, to dodge the issue. That one of our very large local companies paid Owen Paterson, it appears, about £500,000 over some years. And they didn't do that just because they think he's a good chap. They obviously believed they were going to get something back for it.
Yeah, two local companies, of course, were paying him.
Yes, there's another one with a smaller amount, that's right.
Neil Hamilton, I suppose that goes to the core issue of this, and it's about what our MPs are elected to do. And this whole issue of potentially earning large and lucrative sums of money from companies whenever they are sitting inside Parliament. Is that not something that should be changed? Do we need to actually look at whether MPs can take up these kind of paid consultancies?
Well, as I understand it, the rules have changed so that you can't any longer lobby on behalf of a company for which from whom you're receiving any kind of remuneration. In Owen's case, he was claiming that what he did was in the public interest. It wasn't lobbying for the company, but it was to do with public health issues.
The point is, though, it's about the huge amounts of money that MPs potentially get. You yourself, did you earn lots of money from companies whenever you were an MP?
I did have some consultancies, but nothing like the sums of money that were involved here. I was as surprised as anybody that Owen was being paid £100,000 a year, which is a huge sum of money by anyone's standards, more than an MP gets paid for being an MP. And it's unclear what the company sought to obtain in return for that. So I agree, this is something which is wrong. And something should be done about it. But obviously in the 1990s, the climate was very, very different from today. There was much less suspicion of MPs' motives and so on. Today, it's difficult to imagine why anybody goes into public life, actually, because you're damned in the public mind almost from day one.
Well, no, you're held to a certain standard is the truth of it. And if you don't live up to that standard, then you are rightly damned, surely.
Well, in the court of public opinion, there are no rules to ensure fairness, and all the so-called sleaze headlines of the 1990s were mostly about tawdry sex cases rather than breaches of parliamentary rules. But the image is very easy to create in the public mind, and it's very difficult to get it equal kind of publicity for dispelling those.
Well,
nobody was interested in my case, for example, nobody was interested in the results of the Inland Revenue investigation. There's no headline in that. They were only interested in the original allegations, which were screaming headlines over every newspaper in the country.
Well, I mean, as we mentioned, there was a court case which was closely followed by all of the newspapers and indeed the broadcast media as well. But I want to ask you both just a final question about where you think this leaves the Conservative Party, because you saw how damaging it could be, Neil Hamilton, back in the 90s to a party. I suspect now you're the leader of UKIP, you come at it with slightly different views, but do you think this potentially could be very damaging for Boris Johnson and the Conservative Party, or will it be forgotten about in a month's time?
No, my views haven't changed in 25 years on this or indeed many other issues. I do think this has been appallingly badly handled. I agree with Felicity. Boris Johnson is ultimately the person responsible for the Conservative Party, and he seems to have had a personal role in this terribly botched case. I mean, the trouble is, I think we have an entertainer as Prime Minister who takes little interest in the details of policy and thinks that he can get through by flying on the seat of his pants. And that seems to have happened here. He's fallen over, as so often happens, and has got egg on his face, if I can mix my metaphors. And that is the tragedy of the Conservative Party at the moment. It's all over the place. And it isn't, to my mind, recognisably a Conservative Party at all, for a variety of reasons, not least breaking the tax promises that were made at the last general election, which seems to me of a much, much greater importance in terms of politics than this individual case of Owen Paterson.
And Felicity Huston, are you prepared to defend the Conservative Party in this, or do you sit here and think to yourself, actually, a lot of what Neil Hamilton is saying is right?
Oh, I'm certainly not going to get me to defend Boris Johnson. Anybody who's ever heard me talk knows my views on Boris. And this is just another example of it. But I have to say, for the past 18 months to 2 years, the government has done what it wants. It has neutered Parliament. It has been unaccountable. It has run around making decisions based on the latest focus group. And this is another one of these ones where, oh my heavens, well, poor Owen, we must support him. And then they've got the most awful backlash overnight from their from the backbenchers' constituents, and they've panicked yet again. And this is dreadful. And Boris has this Teflon capacity to shrug off everything, but I think this might be the one that will stick. And, when you're Prime Minister, that's where the buck stops, not just the President of the United States. And he has to accept that, and he should be coming out and explaining why he's made such a mess of things.
Neil and Felicity, it's been great to talk to both of you this morning. Really appreciate it. That's Neil Hamilton, who's the leader of UKIP, and also Felicity Huston.
It's 19 minutes past 8. Today's headlines. The Labour Party has announced it will put up a candidate in the upcoming North Shropshire by-election, triggered by the resignation of the Conservative Owen Paterson. Lord Frost and Maros Sefcovic will meet later to decide whether progress has been made on the Northern Ireland Protocol. And the critically acclaimed film Belfast has had its Irish premiere at the Waterfront Hall.
On BBC One. It's the doctor. I don't have much time. The flux is coming. Who are you? This is Yaz. Hi, I'm Yaz. This is Dan.
Doctor, we need you!